The history books are lying to you. The British Empire, the biggest empire that ever existed, covering a quarter of the entire planet, didn't fall because of a military invasion. It didn't fall because of a grand revolution. It fell because of a spreadsheet. It fell because of a debt, a loan taken from the United States that cost the British people, the country, and the royal crown nearly $4 billion. Now, $4 billion might not sound like much today. It's what a single billionaire might spend on a super yacht. But in 1946, that sum was the price tag for the largest geopolitical collapse of the 20th century. This wasn't a decline. It was a fatal trade-off. Britain gave up its global power, its prestige, and the crown jewel of India, all because the economic foundation had been completely gutted by 2 world wars. The whole thing was doomed the moment they realized they couldn't afford to keep the lights on. My single compelling thesis today is this: the British Empire was not conquered. It committed financial suicide. It was the only empire in history that won every major war it fought, yet emerged from those victories completely bankrupt, forcing them to sell the entire house for a single humiliating loan. This is the story of how the greatest global power traded a fifth of the world for a few $1 billion in debt. To understand this crisis, we have to go back to the year 1914. Before World War I, Britain was the richest nation on earth. This wasn't because of its industries, although those were strong. It was because Britain was the world's bank. They were the biggest creditor nation. That means they had loaned more money to other countries, from financing railroads in Argentina to building mines in South Africa, than any other country. Their money, the British pound sterling, wasn't just a currency. It was the world's reserve currency. You could take a pound anywhere in the world and use it to buy almost anything because everyone trusted Britain and everyone wanted a piece of that financial stability. But war is the ultimate destroyer of spreadsheets. World War I was not just a massive conflict. It was the first truly industrialized modern war. The cost was astronomical. It was no longer about a small professional army fighting one battle. It was about mass-producing shells, feeding millions of men, and fueling thousands of machines every single day for 4 long years. Britain had 2 ways to pay for this urgent expenditure. First, they taxed their citizens, which was painful but necessary. Second, they started selling off everything they owned. They sold their overseas assets, those railroads and mines and factories they had built all over the world, bringing the cash back home to fund the war machine. This was like selling the family jewels just to pay the heating bill, but even this wasn't enough. They had to start borrowing. And who did they borrow from? Their new, fresh-faced economic rival across the Atlantic, the United States of America. The United States entered the war late, but their economy was already a giant. They had been industrialized, but unlike Britain, they hadn't yet spent their wealth fighting trench warfare. So, the moment Britain started taking out massive loans from American banks and the American government, the balance of global power began to shift. It was a subtle shift, one that few noticed at the time, but it was fatal. By the time the war ended in 1918, Britain had been financially gutted. They were still victorious, they were still sitting at the peace talks, and they still looked like a great power. The maps still showed red covering a quarter of the globe, but beneath the surface, the truth was terrifying. Britain had gone from the world's largest creditor to the world's largest debtor. They owed the U.S. more than $4 billion, a staggering, almost unbelievable sum for the time. This debt was a dead weight, a financial handcuff that would haunt them for the next 3 decades and ultimately choke the life out of the empire. Think of it like this. The war was a military success, but a financial collapse. Britain had traded its future wealth and financial independence for survival in the present. And once you lose financial independence, political and imperial independence is always the next thing to go. The 1920s were supposed to be a decade of healing, but for Britain, they were just 10 years of denial. British leaders, desperate to restore the old glory and prove they were still the top financial power, made a doomed decision in 1925. They decided to put the British pound back on the gold standard. Now, for non-economists, the gold standard just means that the value of the currency is fixed to a specific amount of gold. It was a sign of ultimate financial reliability. If your currency was on the gold standard, it meant everyone trusted you completely. The problem? Britain had to return the pound to its pre-war value. They essentially pretended that World War I had never happened and that the pound was just as valuable as it was in 1913. This was an act of extreme financial ego. They tried to inflate the value of their currency far beyond what their struggling post-war economy could support. The effect was disastrous. British goods became incredibly expensive for other countries to buy. Imagine you're trying to sell a British-made car to an American buyer. Since the pound was artificially expensive, the car suddenly costs 10 to 20% more than a similar car made in the US or Germany. British exports collapsed, factories closed, unemployment skyrocketed. The only people who benefited were the wealthy who held gold, while the working class suffered from the crippling crisis of high prices and no jobs. This decision, driven purely by the desire to look like a great power, crippled the national economy for the entire decade. The final surrender came in 1931, as the Great Depression spread globally, hitting the already weakened British economy like a hammer. The financial system became completely unsustainable. Foreign investors, seeing the economic mess and realizing Britain possibly maintained the artificial value of the pound, started panicking and pulling their gold out of the Bank of England. The central bank was bleeding gold. The reserves were drying up faster than a puddle in the desert. Finally, in September 1931, the British government had to throw in the towel. They announced that the pound was coming off the gold standard. It was a moment of ultimate humiliation. It was the public, undeniable proof that Britain could no longer dictate global finance. The pound immediately lost 25% of its value overnight. It wasn't just a financial event. It was a loud, clear signal to the rest of the world that the financial sun had finally set on the British Empire. This move, while economically necessary, cemented the fact that London was no longer the global financial capital. That title had decisively shifted to New York. If World War I was a financial hit, World War II was a financial extinction-level event. The second global conflict was even more industrialized, more resource-intensive, and lasted longer. Winston Churchill, the great wartime leader, famously promised that Britain would never surrender. And militarily, they didn't. They won the Battle of Britain. They held out against Germany. They survived. But in purely economic terms, they were completely doomed. They had to fight for 5 years straight, facing a modern, highly efficient German war machine, and they had to do it with an economy that was still reeling from the gold standard debacle of the 1930s. The war cost Britain an estimated £120 billion in today's terms. To pay for this, they had to go back to the same source, the United States. The relationship was formalized under the Lend-Lease Act. This act, passed by the U.S. Congress, basically said that the U.S. would lend Britain and other allies everything they needed: ships, planes, tanks, food, oil, and they would simply pay it back after the war. Churchill famously described this arrangement as like chewing gum. We should send the gun, and we would get the stick back. In reality, it meant that Britain's war effort was entirely dependent on American goodwill and American manufacturing. Britain had to sell off the rest of its overseas investments, the last of the family jewels, to pay for what little they could themselves. By 1945, Britain's debt to the U.S. and its financial obligations to the U.S. was so massive it exceeded Britain's entire gross domestic product. Imagine owing more than your entire country produces in a year. That was the urgent financial position of the victorious British Empire. The most urgent sign of this fatal dependence came immediately after the war. In August 1945, just days after the Japanese surrender, the U.S. government suddenly terminated the Lend-Lease program. It was a cold, brutal move that signaled the U.S. was done with charity. "You won," they said. "Now pay up." Britain was left completely stranded. They had no money, their factories had been bombed, their trade routes were destroyed, and their economy was entirely focused on the war effort. not on making things people could actually buy. The country was so poor that food rationing, which had started during the war, actually had to be extended after the war ended. Rationing would continue until 1954, nearly a decade after the victory. The winners were eating Spam and powdered eggs, while the losers were beginning to rebuild. This massive financial crisis meant that the government had to go begging. The final climax moment of financial surrender came in 1946 with the Anglo-American Loan Agreement. John Maynard Keynes, the most famous economist of the century, was sent to Washington to negotiate a rescue package. He didn't just walk into a negotiation, he walked into an execution. The U.S. negotiators, backed by Congress, were in no mood for generosity. They saw their opportunity to formally and permanently take over the role of the world's superpower. The U.S. agreed to lend Britain $3.75 billion, which, when you include a small Canadian loan taken at the same time, rounds out to the $4 billion figure in the title. This was an urgent loan designed to prevent the complete, immediate starvation and financial collapse of the country. But the terms of the loan were absolutely fatal to the British Empire. First, the U.S. demanded that Britain immediately make the pound convertible into dollars. This meant that after a transition period, anyone holding British pounds could exchange them for U.S. dollars. This was a direct attack on the pound sterling's standing, forcing it to bow to the dollar. It was the U.S. saying, "Our currency is now the one that matters." Second, and most doomed for the empire, the U.S. loan came with an implicit, unwritten understanding: decolonization. The Americans were not fans of the British Empire. They saw the colonial system as outdated and an obstacle to global free trade, which the U.S., as the world's biggest manufacturer, desperately wanted. They didn't put "give up India" in the fine print, but the message was clear. If Britain was going to rely on American money, they would have to start dismantling the empire that had made them rich but was now just too expensive to maintain. The British government had no choice. They were forced to accept the loan, accepting what one historian called the economic Dunkirk. The sheer relief of getting the cash to keep the country alive was followed by the crushing realization of what they had signed away. In 1947, Britain gave up India. The urgent financial need to cut costs and the realization that they could no longer afford the military and administrative burden of the crown jewel sealed its fate. India's independence, followed by Pakistan and Burma, was the first domino. It revealed the secret. The empire was an enormous economic liability, and Britain, in its bankrupt state, simply couldn't afford to be an empire anymore. It was an economic decision dressed up as a political necessity. The most powerful symbol of the empire was gone, traded for a temporary lifeline from the new master of the free world. The climax of this whole financial tragedy came in 1956 with the Suez Crisis. This moment, more than any other, exposed the total collapse of British power and its complete dependence on American finance. The Suez Canal was a critical artery for the empire, connecting Europe to Asia and allowing the British Navy and trade ships to move quickly. It was an essential global choke point. When the Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the canal, meaning he took control of it away from the British and French private shareholders, it was seen as a direct attack on British prestige and global trade. The British Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, reacted with an old-school imperial mindset. He secretly colluded with France and Israel to launch a military operation to retake the canal by force. This was Britain trying to act like a great power again. This was the moment they tried to prove that the $4 billion loan had bought their soul. The military operation was a success. British and French forces quickly defeated the Egyptians and occupied the canal zone. But the fatal blow didn't come from Egypt. It came from the American president, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower was furious. He hadn't been consulted, and he viewed the invasion as a reckless, unnecessary distraction from the Cold War. He needed to show the world, and specifically the Soviet Union, who was truly in charge now. Eisenhower didn't send in tanks or troops. He used the only weapon that mattered: finance. The United States threatened to sell off its large holdings of British government bonds, the debt that Britain was still paying off from the world wars. If the U.S. started dumping British debt on the international market, the British pound would instantly collapse. The entire British economy would face hyperinflation, bank runs, and a financial meltdown that would be catastrophic. Prime Minister Eden had no choice. He was faced with the urgent reality: either keep the canal for a few weeks and face total national bankruptcy, or pull the troops out. In ultimate humiliation, Eden ordered the British forces to withdraw. The Suez Crisis was the moment the British Empire officially ceased to exist in everything but name. The message was loud and clear: Britain could no longer conduct independent foreign policy. Its sovereignty was conditional. Its ability to act in the world was dependent on American permission. The military was still formidable, but the money was gone, and without money, the power was doomed. The $4 billion loan hadn't just rescued Britain. It had put Britain on a short leash. After 1956, the final phase of peripheral losses began in earnest. Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, the rest of the African and Caribbean colonies realized the mother country was broke and dependent. The cascade of independence accelerated until by 1970, the British Empire was over. So, that is the story. The British Empire, the empire where the sun never set, was not defeated on the battlefield. It was financially asphyxiated. It won the war but lost the balance sheet. The core of this fatal trade-off lies in two inescapable facts. First, the two world wars were so financially devastating that they shifted Britain from being the world's biggest creditor to its biggest debtor, a change that was urgent and permanent. Second, the subsequent reliance on American loans, finalized with the $4 billion package, gave the United States the final, decisive leverage it needed. The debt became the weapon, and the U.S. used it to dismantle their old rival's power structure. What we learn from this is a timeless lesson in economics. Military might can only ever be a temporary shield for a bankrupt treasury. When the money runs out, all the history, all the pride, and all the flags in the world mean absolutely nothing. The crisis will eventually come home. The greatest empire in history was traded for a few $1 billion, because in the modern world, the most powerful currency is not the sword, but the dollar. If you want to understand the current financial crisis facing global powers today and how this exact pattern of debt, dependence, and collapse is playing out right now, hit that subscribe button.